Mafia boss insults waitress in Italian, stunned when she replies perfectly and calls him out. The restaurant fell silent as the man's fist crashed against the wooden table, causing wine glasses to tremble precariously. His dark suit, perfectly tailored to his broad shoulders, marked him as someone important, someone dangerous in the quiet streets of Boston. His entourage of 6 men stiffened, hands instinctively moving beneath their jackets as their boss's face contorted with rage. The young waitress had simply informed him that his preferred table was unavailable tonight, a minor inconvenience that somehow warranted this explosive display. Sei un ristorante patetico. Non sai chi sono? He snarled in perfect Italian, his accent revealing northern roots as he continued his tirade, assuming no one could understand his vicious insults. The restaurant patrons looked away nervously, pretending not to notice the unfolding drama. The waitress, a slender woman with auburn hair tied back in a simple ponytail, stood perfectly still, her expression unreadable as she absorbed his verbal assault. She wore no makeup save for a touch of lip gloss, her natural beauty needing no enhancement. 3 seconds passed in tense silence before she leaned forward slightly, her green eyes locking with his cold blue ones. Capisco perfettamente, signore, she replied in flawless Italian, her accent impeccable. E lei dovrebbe vergognarsi di parlare così. The color drained from the man's face as she continued in Italian, informing him that she understood every word, including his crude insults and threats. The restaurant remained frozen in collective shock as she suggested he could either wait 15 minutes like everyone else or find another establishment. His men exchanged worried glances, unsure how to react to someone standing up to their feared boss. The man himself seemed caught between fury and fascination, his eyes narrowing as he studied her with newfound interest. "Who taught you to speak like that?" he asked in English, his voice softer now, but still carrying an edge of danger that made nearby diners shift uncomfortably in their seats. His question contained more than mere curiosity. It held suspicion. "My grandmother was from Florence," she answered simply, maintaining eye contact without flinching. "Now, would you like to wait at the bar, or should I direct you to another restaurant in the area?" Something shifted in the man's expression, a flicker of respect, perhaps even amusement. His entourage remained tense, hands still hovering near concealed weapons as they awaited his reaction to this unexpected challenge. "The bar will be fine," he finally said, rising slowly from his seat with a fluid grace that belied his imposing frame. "And bring me your best scotch. Neat." The tension in the restaurant began to dissolve as he moved toward the bar, though conversations remained hushed. The waitress released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline continued to course through her veins. Later that evening, as she delivered his table's appetizers, he placed a generous tip beneath his water glass and slid a business card across the table. "Andrew Valentini," it read simply, with only a phone number embossed in gold beneath the name. "My apologies for earlier," he said quietly, his tone sincere despite the dangerous glint that never quite left his eyes. "Perhaps I could make it up to you sometime." 2 days later, Claire pushed through the door of her favorite coffee shop, the small bell announcing her arrival as she sought refuge from the unseasonable autumn rain. Her hair hung in damp tendrils around her face as she shook water from her coat. The rich aroma of freshly ground beans enveloped her, a comforting embrace after a morning of teaching Italian literature to disinterested undergraduates. She ordered her usual, a simple cappuccino with an extra shot, and turned to find a seat in the crowded space. That's when she saw him, Andrew Valentini, sitting alone by the window, his attention focused on a leather-bound notebook. He wore no tie today, his crisp white shirt open at the collar, revealing a glimpse of a tattoo that disappeared beneath expensive fabric. Recognition flickered across his face when he glanced up, followed by something that might have been pleasure. He closed his notebook deliberately and gestured to the empty chair across from him, an invitation that felt both dangerous and impossible to refuse. "I didn't expect to see you here," Claire said as she sat down, her voice steadier than she felt. The coffee shop suddenly seemed smaller, as if his presence consumed the available oxygen. Andrew's mouth curved into a smile that transformed his face, softening the hard lines around his eyes. "I own the building," he replied, his voice lower than she remembered. "I come here to think sometimes." Claire studied him across the small table, noting the shadows beneath his eyes and the tension in his shoulders. "You look like someone carrying too many secrets," she observed before she could stop herself. His expression changed, surprise replacing the careful neutrality he maintained. "Most people are too afraid to speak to me that way," he said, leaning forward slightly. "Why aren't you?" My father always said fear is just curiosity that hasn't found its voice yet, she replied, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic mug. And I've always been too curious for my own good. Andrew laughed then, a genuine sound that drew glances from nearby tables. Your father sounds like a wise man, he said, studying her with renewed interest. Is he the one who taught you to stand your ground against men like me? Claire's expression darkened momentarily as she traced the rim of her cup with one finger. My father died when I was 15, she answered quietly. But yes, he taught me never to bow my head to intimidation. Silence stretched between them, neither uncomfortable nor easy, simply a space filled with unasked questions. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the windows and creating a private soundtrack for their unexpected meeting. My grandmother from Florence, Andrew began, breaking the silence. She used to quote Dante when I was a child. L'amor che muove il sole e l'altre stelle. His accent was perfect, the words flowing like water over stones. Claire's eyes widened slightly, recognizing the line from Paradiso. The love that moves the sun and the other stars, she translated automatically. You've read Dante's Divine Comedy? There are many sides to me that might surprise you, Claire, he said, using her name for the first time. The sound of it on his lips sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. Claire's apartment was a sanctuary of books and warm colors, shelves lining every available wall space in her modest one-bedroom home. Classical music played softly as she graded papers, red pen marking thoughtful comments in the margins of her students' essays on Petrarchan's sonnets. Her life followed a predictable pattern: teaching during the day, research in the evenings, occasional dinners with colleagues who shared her passion for Renaissance literature. She had built this quiet existence deliberately after the chaos of her childhood, finding comfort in academic pursuits. Andrew's world couldn't have been more different, a fact made abundantly clear as he sat in his office overlooking the Boston harbor, listening to reports about territory disputes. The Valentini family had controlled the waterfront for 3 generations, their legitimate businesses masking more profitable ventures. The weight of his responsibilities pressed down on him like a physical force as he dismissed his lieutenants, remaining alone with the panoramic view of the city he both protected and exploited. His father's portrait hung on the wall, a constant reminder of expectations and legacy. 3 weeks had passed since the coffee shop, and Andrew had found himself thinking about Claire more often than he cared to admit. Her directness, so different from the calculated deference he typically encountered, had left an impression he couldn't easily dismiss. He turned the business card over in his fingers, not his own, but hers, which she had given him as they parted ways. Boston University, Department of Italian Studies, it read, alongside her name and contact information, a window into her world. The rational part of his mind warned against pursuing any connection with someone so removed from his reality. Claire existed in sunlight, in the world of ideas and beauty, while he operated in shadows and pragmatic violence when necessary. Yet something about her had awakened a long-dormant curiosity in him, a desire to experience something genuine in a life surrounded by strategic relationships and calculated loyalties. Her honesty was as refreshing as it was dangerous. He reached for his phone, hesitating only briefly before dialing her number. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across his office as he waited, wondering what words he would choose when she answered. Claire's voice, slightly breathless, as if she had rushed to answer, filled the line. Professor Montgomery speaking, she said, professional and composed despite the slight elevation in her tone. It's Andrew, he replied simply, realizing he had no prepared speech, no strategic approach to this conversation. I was wondering if you might be free for dinner tomorrow evening. The pause that followed seemed to stretch into eternity, filled with all the reasons this was a terrible idea. Their worlds existed on opposite sides of an unbridgeable divide: academia and organized crime, literature and power, transparency and secrets. There's a small Italian place on Hanover Street, she finally answered, surprising them both with her acceptance. 7 o'clock? I'll meet you there. As he confirmed the details, Andrew felt something shift within him, a subtle realignment of priorities. For the first time in years, business would wait while he pursued something solely for himself, regardless of the complications it would inevitably bring. Claire hung up the phone and stared at it in her hand, wondering what forces had compelled her to accept his invitation. Something in his voice had reached past her carefully constructed defenses, touching a part of her that craved more than the safety of books and classrooms. The small Italian restaurant on Hanover Street buzzed with conversation as Claire entered, her emerald dress catching the soft glow of pendant lights. She spotted Andrew immediately, seated in a corner booth away from windows, two of his men lingering discreetly at the bar. "You look beautiful," he said, as she slid into the seat across from him, his eyes taking in the simple gold necklace at her throat. The restaurant owner himself approached with a bottle of wine, bowing slightly to Andrew with obvious deference. Claire noticed how other diners glanced their way, curiosity and apprehension mingling in their quick looks. "People are afraid of you," she observed quietly as the wine was poured. "Does that bother you?" Andrew considered her question, swirling the ruby liquid in his glass before answering. "Fear creates distance," he finally replied, "and sometimes distance is necessary in my position." They ordered in Italian, the conversation flowing more easily than either had expected as they discovered shared interests beyond Dante. Andrew spoke of his travels through Tuscany, while Claire described the year she spent researching in Florence archives. "My grandmother would have liked you," he said unexpectedly, his expression softening with memory. "She used to say that strong women are God's way of keeping powerful men honest." As dinner progressed, Claire found herself drawn to the contradictions in him. The ruthless businessman who could quote poetry, the feared leader who spoke of his grandmother with genuine tenderness. The warning bells in her mind grew fainter with each glass of wine. Andrew felt something shift inside him as he watched her laugh, a genuine sound untainted by calculation or fear. He had grown accustomed to people telling him what they thought he wanted to hear, their words carefully chosen to avoid his displeasure. "Why did you really invite me to dinner?" Claire asked suddenly, her directness cutting through the pleasant haze of wine and conversation. Her green eyes held his, demanding truth rather than charm. The question caught him off guard, stripping away the practiced responses he typically employed. "Because you're the first person in years who spoke to me as a man, rather than a reputation," he answered, surprising himself with his honesty. Claire nodded slowly, accepting his answer without comment as she sipped her wine. Outside the restaurant, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up, the driver watching the entrance with calculated vigilance. Two more cars joined the first, positioning themselves strategically along the street as men in dark suits exited, adjusting their jackets to better conceal shoulder holsters. Andrew's phone buzzed with a text message, his expression hardening as he read it. "We need to leave," he said, his tone suddenly businesslike as he signaled for the check. "Now, Claire." She sensed the shift in atmosphere, the tension radiating from him as his men at the bar straightened, hands moving beneath their jackets. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice low and controlled despite her racing heart. Andrew leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "There are men outside who mean us harm," he said simply. "Trust me right now, and I promise I'll explain everything later." 6 days passed before Claire heard from Andrew again. 6 days of jumping at shadows and questioning her own judgment. She had been escorted home that night through a service entrance, Andrew's men forming a protective barrier around her until she was safely inside her apartment. News reports the following morning mentioned a shooting outside an Italian restaurant in the North End. 2 men killed in what police called an apparent gang-related incident. Claire recognized the restaurant's name, knew that she might have been caught in the crossfire. When Andrew finally called, his voice was strained with what sounded like regret. "I need to see you," he said simply, "to explain things properly, if you'll let me." This time they met at his penthouse overlooking the harbor, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of boats drifting like white specks on the darkening water. Security personnel discreetly patrolled the perimeter, a reminder of the danger that followed him. "Those men were from the Calabrese family," Andrew explained as he poured her a glass of whiskey, his movements precise, controlled. "They've been trying to move into our territory for months now." Claire accepted the drink, letting the amber liquid burn a path down her throat. "And what exactly is your territory?" she asked, no longer willing to dance around the truth of who he was. Andrew studied her for a long moment, weighing his response. "Import, export, construction, waste management," he began, then paused, adding more softly, "protection services, some gambling operations, control of certain shipping routes." "You're telling me you're in the Mafia," Claire stated flatly, no question in her tone, as pieces of a puzzle she had deliberately avoided suddenly clicked into place. The restaurant confrontation, the deferential treatment, the armed escorts, it all made terrible sense now. Andrew didn't deny it, his silence confirmation enough as he moved to stand beside the window, his reflection ghost-like against the darkening sky. My father built this organization, he said finally. I inherited both its benefits and its burdens. Claire set her glass down carefully, the crystal making a soft clink against the marble table. I should leave, she said, rising from her seat, suddenly aware of the danger she had invited into her carefully constructed life. You should, he agreed, turning to face her. Walking away right now would be the sensible choice. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibilities both enticing and frightening. Claire took a step toward the door, then stopped, her reflection joining his in the window as she moved to stand beside him instead. I've never been particularly sensible, she admitted, her voice barely audible above the soft hum of the climate control system. My mother always said that was my greatest flaw. Andrew's hand found hers, fingers intertwining with a gentleness that belied his dangerous reputation. Tell me about her, he said, offering an invitation to share more than just physical space. The hours blurred together as they talked, really talked, barriers falling as night deepened around them. Andrew spoke of his father's expectations, the weight of family legacy that had shaped his choices since childhood. Claire revealed her own complicated past, her father's death in what authorities had called a random mugging, her mother's subsequent spiral into addiction, her own determination to build something stable from the chaos. No pretense remained between them, only raw, unfiltered truth. Dawn was breaking when Andrew finally called a car to take her home. Exhaustion and emotional intimacy, having created a different kind of vulnerability between them. This can't work, he said softly as they stood in the elevator. You know that, don't you? 3 weeks of cautious happiness followed, a delicate balance of Claire's academic world and carefully controlled glimpses into Andrew's. They met in private spaces, her apartment, his penthouse, a lakeside cabin outside the city, avoiding the public eye and the dangers it might bring. The transformation in Andrew was subtle but unmistakable to those who knew him well. His lieutenant Carlos noticed it first. The slight softening around his eyes, the occasional distraction during business meetings, the private phone calls that brought rare smiles to his otherwise stoic expression. The Calabresi are making moves again, Carlos reported one afternoon, sliding surveillance photos across Andrew's desk. They've been watching the university boss, specifically the Italian Studies department. Ice formed in Andrew's veins as he studied the images. Claire leaving her classroom, stopping for coffee, unlocking her apartment door. The message couldn't have been clearer if they'd painted it in blood across her doorway. He dismissed Carlos with a nod, then sat alone in his office as darkness gathered, weighing options that all seemed to end in loss. The Valentini family had enemies. Always had. Always would. It was the nature of the business, the price of power in their world. Claire had become his weakness, a vulnerability his enemies had already identified and would not hesitate to exploit. The realization settled like lead in his stomach as he reached for his phone to make the call that would break both their hearts. She knew something was wrong the moment she saw his face, the careful blankness of his expression as he entered her apartment that evening. You're ending this, she said before he could speak, her academic mind quickly processing the evidence before her. They know about you, Andrew confirmed, maintaining a careful distance between them. The Calabresi family. They've been watching you, sending a message to me through their surveillance. The photographs Carlos had shown Andrew revealed not just Claire's daily routine, but something more disturbing, a man in a dark coat who had followed her for weeks undetected. This shadow had stood outside her classroom, waited across from her favorite bookstore, even sat 3 tables away during her weekly coffee meetup with colleagues. Andrew's security team had identified him as Paolo Calabresi, nephew of the family patriarch, and known for his particular brand of cruelty. The implied threat couldn't have been clearer. They knew exactly how to hurt Andrew most effectively now, and they were demonstrating their patience. Claire's fingers trembled slightly as she processed this information, memories of her father's last days suddenly vivid in her mind. He too had been followed before his cover was blown, subtle warnings escalating into that final, fatal encounter that police had dismissed as random violence. There's something else, Andrew said, his voice dropping even lower as he pulled out his phone and showed her an intercepted message. On the screen was a conversation between Calabresi operatives mentioning Claire's mother, her current address, her medication schedule, her vulnerability. The color drained from Claire's face as she read the exchange, realizing the threat extended beyond her to the one person she had left in the world. Her mother had rebuilt her life after years of addiction following her husband's murder, her sobriety now a fragile treasure that Claire refused to see destroyed. Claire felt her carefully constructed world tilting beneath her feet. the danger she had intellectually acknowledged suddenly becoming viscerally real. "So you're just giving up?" she challenged, anger rising to mask the fear crawling up her spine. "I'm protecting you," he corrected, his voice hardening with resolve. "This isn't a negotiation, Claire. These people don't make empty threats, and I won't risk your life because of who I am." The silence that followed felt like a physical entity, heavy and suffocating as it filled the small space between them. Claire moved to her bookshelf, fingers tracing the spine of a worn volume of Dante before turning back to face him. "My father wasn't killed in a random mugging," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "He worked for the FBI, investigating organized crime in Chicago. His cover was blown 2 days before he was murdered." Andrew's expression changed. Surprise followed quickly by understanding as this new information forced a recalibration of everything he thought he knew about her. "You knew exactly who I was from the beginning," he realized, the pieces falling into place. "I recognized your name that first night at the restaurant," she admitted, meeting his gaze without flinching. "The Valentini family has quite the file in federal records. I should know. I've read it cover to cover." Andrew moved toward her then, stopping just short of reaching out. "Why would you put yourself at risk like this? Was it some misguided attempt at justice for your father?" Claire shook her head, a sad smile touching her lips. "I told myself I was just curious at first. Then I told myself I was gathering information. But the truth?" She paused, vulnerability evident in her eyes. "I fell in love with the man behind the name, despite everything I knew I should feel." Andrew stepped back, creating physical distance while his mind raced to process Claire's revelation. "You need to leave Boston," he said finally, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Tonight. I'll arrange everything. New identity, new position at a university far from here." Claire shook her head, defiance flashing in her eyes, despite the fear she couldn't fully hide. "I won't be chased away from my life, my career, everything I've built," she insisted, crossing her arms protectively across her chest. "This isn't a game, Claire," Andrew replied, frustration bleeding into his voice as he ran a hand through his hair. "The Calabrese family doesn't make idle threats. They'll use you to get to me, and they won't be gentle about it." The weight of reality settled over them both as night deepened outside Claire's apartment windows. By morning, she had agreed to a temporary compromise, a sabbatical, officially to conduct research, actually to disappear until Andrew could resolve the threat. He didn't tell her his plan, didn't mention the meeting already scheduled with the heads of 3 allied families, didn't discuss the dangerous gamble he was about to make. Some burdens were his alone to carry, the price of his position. The goodbye at the private airfield was brief, practical, both of them aware of watching eyes that might report back to enemies. 6 weeks, Andrew promised, his hand lingering on hers for one moment longer than necessary. "Stay safe until then." As her plane disappeared into cloud cover, Andrew returned to his car where Carlos waited with details of the upcoming meeting. The plan was already in motion, a dangerous restructuring that would either secure his future or destroy everything his family had built. Empty days stretched into weeks as Claire settled into the remote cabin in northern Maine, her only company the security team stationed discreetly on the property perimeter. She filled hours with research and writing, trying to ignore the constant worry gnawing at her concentration. The satellite phone Andrew had given her remained silent, except for brief weekly check-ins, his voice increasingly strained each time despite his assurances that everything was proceeding according to plan. She recognized the sound of someone carrying an unbearable burden. 4 weeks into her exile, Claire woke to find the head of her security detail standing in her kitchen, his expression grim as he handed her a sealed envelope. "Direct orders from Mr. Valentini," he explained, stepping back respectfully to give her privacy. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing 3 sentences in Andrew's distinctive handwriting. "Whatever you hear, don't believe it. Wait for Carlos. I love you." The last 3 words blurred as tears filled her eyes, the first time he had expressed the feeling so directly. 2 days later, news reports announced the shocking murder of Boston crime boss Andrew Valentini, gunned down outside his downtown office in what authorities described as an escalation in an ongoing turf war. The security team around Claire's cabin immediately doubled. Carlos arrived 3 days after the news broke, his face haggard with exhaustion as he presented Claire with a thumb drive and a set of passports. "He wanted you to have these," he said simply, refusing to elaborate further as he escorted her to a waiting helicopter. The contents of the thumb drive explained everything. Detailed evidence of the Calabrese family's operations, financial records of corrupt officials, locations of weapon caches and drug warehouses. Andrew had compiled enough evidence to destroy his rivals completely. The most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Andrew had somehow obtained internal Calabrese family documents linking them directly to the murder of Claire's father 8 years earlier. The hit had been ordered as retribution for his undercover work, with details that had never been released to the public or even to his family. Claire sat frozen in her cabin's living room, staring at her father's case file that Andrew had included. Information the FBI had deliberately withheld from her family. The official story of a random mugging had been a convenient lie, protecting ongoing investigations while denying them closure. Among the evidence was an audio recording of Paolo Calabrese boasting about eliminating the Montgomery problem, describing with sickening detail how Claire's father had been followed for weeks before the carefully staged robbery that left him bleeding in an alley. Her hands shook as she forced herself to listen to the end. Andrew had included a personal letter explaining his plan. By sacrificing his own identity and position, he could ensure the Calabrese family would fall completely while creating an opportunity for them both to escape the cycle of violence. His detailed confession would be released only after he was presumed dead, timed precisely to maximize damage to his enemies. The final coordinates led to a coastal property registered under a shell company, purchased 3 years earlier when Andrew had first begun contemplating an exit strategy. Before meeting Claire, it had been merely a contingency plan. After knowing her, it had become his goal, a possibility of something he had never dared hope for: freedom. Claire understood the magnitude of what he had done, the sacrifice made not just for her, but for himself, a chance at freedom from the life that had been chosen for him, rather than by him. The final file contained coordinates and a date 3 weeks in the future. The FBI raid on the Calabrese family headquarters made international headlines, the scale of arrests unprecedented in organized crime investigations of the past decade. Claire watched from a hotel room in Vancouver, her new passport identifying her as Professor Catherine Miller. Witness testimony from an unnamed high-level informant had provided authorities with everything needed to dismantle one of the East Coast's most dangerous criminal organizations. Speculation about the informant's identity ran wild in news reports and social media. Prosecutors announced immunity deals for several members of the Valentini organization in exchange for testimony against the Calabrese family and corrupt officials. The carefully orchestrated legal maneuver bore the unmistakable signature of someone who had planned every detail. Carlos arrived exactly 2 weeks after the raids, bringing news that the remaining Valentini operations had been legally restructured under legitimate business entities. He transferred everything, Carlos explained. All legitimate now, with the right people in place. Claire listened in stunned silence as Carlos detailed the transformation Andrew had engineered, the charitable foundation established in his grandmother's name, the scholarship fund for children of violence victims, the witness protection arrangements for former associates willing to leave the life. He planned this for months, she realized aloud, pieces falling into place as she remembered his distracted moments, the late-night phone calls, the mysterious meetings. The Calabrese threat just accelerated his timeline. Carlos nodded, a rare smile crossing his weathered face. Boss always said meeting you changed everything, made him want something different, something better. He handed her a final envelope before departing. The coordinates he sent. Be there in 1 week. The small coastal town in Oregon seemed worlds away from Boston's criminal underworld, waves crashing against rugged cliffs as Claire drove along the winding road. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she approached the isolated cottage perched on the headland. She hardly recognized him at first. His hair longer, face thinner, designer suits replaced by casual clothes that somehow made him seem both younger and more substantial. Andrew stood on the porch watching her approach, uncertainty visible in his posture. The reports of my death were greatly exaggerated, he said, as she stepped from the car, his attempt at humor undermined by the vulnerability in his eyes. The question hung unspoken between them. Would she stay now that everything had changed? Claire crossed the distance between them slowly, taking in the changes in him, the weight of leadership visibly lifted from his shoulders. So who are you now, if not Andrew Valentini? She asked, stopping just short of touching him. The cottage held other surprises. A small office with 2 job offers already arranged, university positions that would allow them both to teach while maintaining a low profile. Andrew had leveraged connections far from his criminal world to secure these legitimate opportunities, ensuring they would have means to support themselves. On the bookshelf beside classics of Italian literature sat several leather-bound journals, Andrew's personal writings from the past year, documenting his gradual disillusionment with the family business and his increasingly desperate search for a way out that wouldn't result in bloodshed for those loyal to him. My grandmother once told me that a man can't outrun his past, but he can choose to plant different seeds for his future, he said, leading Claire to the back porch that overlooked the crashing waves below. The view stretched endlessly, a metaphor for possibilities neither had believed were within reach. Claire noticed the subtle changes in his demeanor. Gone was the vigilant tension that had characterized his movements in Boston, the constant awareness of threats and calculation of advantage. In its place was something approaching peace, though old habits remained in the way his eyes still scanned the perimeter periodically. What struck her most was the sound of his laugh, fuller, uninhibited by the weight of reputation and responsibility that had constrained him before. When he spoke of their future possibilities, his hands moved animatedly, painting pictures of ordinary joys that had once seemed impossible fantasies. "David Wells," he answered, presenting a new identity created through channels that wouldn't be traced back to either of them. History professor with a specialization in Renaissance Italian literature. Apparently, I've just been offered a position at Pacific Northwest University. Sunlight broke through clouds as Claire closed the final distance between them, her hand reaching up to touch his face, confirming the reality of his presence. "Professor Wells will need someone to show him around the department," she said softly. The kiss that followed was different from those they had shared before. No shadows lurking at the edges, no unspoken threats hanging over their heads, just the possibility of something neither had dared hope for. Second chances were rare in either of their worlds. Andrew led her inside the cottage, where books already lined shelves and research papers were spread across a desk by the window. "I've been catching up on my Dante," he explained, a hint of his old confidence returning as he showed her his new life. 1 year later, Claire stood in the faculty lounge of Pacific Northwest University, watching David interact with colleagues during the department's welcome reception. He moved with ease among the academics, his natural charm and genuine interest in their work quickly making him a favorite. No one questioned their backstory. They had met at a conference in Florence, bonded over shared research interests, fallen in love amid ancient architecture and poetry. The simple narrative contained just enough truth to be convincing, while revealing nothing of the danger that had brought them together. "Your husband is quite the addition to our department," the dean commented, joining Claire by the refreshment table. "His paper on modern interpretations of Dante's Inferno has already been accepted for the symposium in Chicago next month." Claire smiled, pride mixing with amusement as she watched David expertly navigate a debate about translation ethics with the linguistics professor. The skills that had once helped him manage criminal territories now served him well in academic politics. Their cottage had become a true home over the past year, filled with books and music, and the comfortable routines of a shared life. Sometimes at night, she would find him standing on the porch, looking out over the ocean with an expression that suggested he still couldn't believe his freedom. The nightmares came less frequently now, those moments when he would wake suddenly, reaching for weapons that were no longer there, haunted by decisions made in his former life. Claire had her own ghosts, her father's memory a presence that both connected and complicated their relationship. They had made a pact to be honest about their pasts while focusing on their future, acknowledging the darkness without letting it eclipse the light they had found together. Some days were easier than others, the transition from their former lives still a work in progress. David excused himself from the academic discussion and made his way back to Claire's side, his hand finding hers with the easy familiarity of people who had faced death together. "Ready to go home?" he asked, the private smile they shared containing worlds of meaning. The drive along the coast was one of their simple pleasures, windows down to let in the salt air as David recounted amusing faculty politics with the same analytical precision he once applied to territory disputes. Some skills, it seemed, transferred surprisingly well across worlds. At home, Claire kicked off her shoes and headed to the kitchen, while David checked the perimeter, a security habit he couldn't quite break, despite the peaceful nature of their new life. Old instincts died hard, particularly those that had kept them alive. Later, as moonlight spilled across their bed, David traced the line of Claire's jaw with gentle fingers. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly, the question he still needed reassurance on occasionally. "Giving up your position at Boston, your colleagues, your name?" Claire turned to face him fully, her answer requiring no thought. "I gave up a job and a location," she corrected, "but I found myself, found us. That's not a sacrifice. It's a choice I'd make again in a heartbeat." David reached for the small box on the nightstand, something he had carried for weeks waiting for the right moment. "I was thinking," he said, opening it to reveal a simple gold band. "Maybe we could make it official. Legally, I mean. With our new names and our new life." Claire's breath caught as she recognized the ring. Not an expensive diamond that would have suited his former status, but a delicate gold band inset with small emeralds, the exact shade of her eyes. The choice reflected everything about their transformation. Priorities shifted from power to beauty. A year and a half after their first confrontation in that Boston restaurant, David whispered the same 3 words in Italian that had changed everything. "Ti amo davvero." "I truly love you." This time, they weren't spoken in anger or fear, but as a promise for their future. The small coastal community had accepted them easily. The new history professor and his wife, the Italian literature specialist who occasionally gave lectures at the local library on Renaissance poetry. Their neighbors found them charming, if somewhat private, never suspecting the vigilance behind their friendly smiles. Claire had found unexpected fulfillment in teaching community college students, many of whom were first-generation Americans or immigrants, seeking education later in life. Their hunger for knowledge reminded her of her own journey, though she kept the darker chapters of her story carefully locked away. They maintained certain precautions: separate bank accounts under their new identities, a secure satellite phone for emergency contact with Carlos, who now managed the legitimate Valentini businesses, and regular security sweeps of their property. Old habits died hard, even in paradise. Each year on her father's birthday, Claire privately reviewed the evidence Andrew had compiled against those responsible for his murder. The satisfaction of knowing the Calabrese family had been dismantled, its leaders imprisoned for decades on federal charges, brought a sense of justice neither she nor her mother had expected to find. The cottage garden had become Claire's passion, a tangible metaphor for their new life taking root. David often found her there among the herbs and flowers, her hands in the soil, building something beautiful from scratch, just as they were doing with their second chance at life together. Outside their window, waves crashed against the Oregon coastline, the rhythmic sound a reminder of time's constant forward motion. The past couldn't be erased, but it could be transformed, just as they had transformed themselves, breaking free from patterns that once seemed inescapable. Thank you all for following this story. If you're enjoying it, please write in the comments which place you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the video, as your support is important for me to continue creating content here.